being an architect is an interesting job, right? He has like three different people. He gets three different definitions of what architecture and being an architect means. And to be quite honest, I don't think I have the answers even. I can only share sort of where my current thinking is at, right? And my current thinking is that architects are kind of the people who see things that not everybody else sees. They like sort of look at things from a different angle. They look at things from slightly different dimensions. And I find that very helpful in the context of software delivery, right? Delivery without architecture probably runs into trouble, but likewise, architecture without software delivery is also not very meaningful. You just get tapestries. But I think sort of having the ability to have the delivery team see one side or one dimension, having the architects looking at the same thing from a different point of view, I think that combination is actually really useful. And to make that more concrete is architects often look at things from the dimension of the rate of change, right? Often when we build software, we look at, okay, what does the software need to do, right? And then we build what it needs to do. But of course, what the software needs to do will change. Also, the scale it needs to support will change. The platform it sits on might change. Any other things might change. So the architects often, I say, they live in the first derivative, right? They don't look just at the static picture. They also look at how things will change over time. And that's one of those additional dimensions. So that's why I think it's very important.
Cool. So that aligns very nicely with some of the things that I've been thinking lately in terms of what counts as good software engineering in a different ways. I've started to use the phrase that I think that the quality of the systems that we build is defined by our ability to change the systems. And so working in ways that allow us to change the systems is essential. I like that perspective in terms of, taking that broader picture of change. Do you see these things though as being very different? Do you see architecture and software development or software engineering, being distinct? I confess I see them as a little bit blurry between where the boundaries are.
Yeah, they're definitely blurry. I think most important, as already hinted, they play off each other. So it can never be that one is more important than the other, or sort of one can be done without the other, right? So I think it's critical to understand there are sort of two sides of the same coin. They're only valuable in combination. So that puts away with all the discussions like which one is more important, which one do I do first and last, right? I never have an answer to those questions because to me it's sort of inherently jointed at the hip, right? And I think that way it adds value. Now, if you talk about how distinct it is, I find it useful to separate architecture as a function from architecture as a role, right? There's the architecture and then there's the architect, right? And both of those have gradations on how distinct or how healthily blurred they can be, right? Like in many cases, the architect role actually sits within the teams. And many companies don't even have people with the title architect. Like I worked at Google before, there's no architects. I work at AWS now. We don't have folks called architects, but surely we have a pretty decent architecture. So somebody is doing it. And I think once you make that separation, this sort of which side does what kind of thing takes on a different kind of light, and you have a more fruitful discussion about it.
Yeah, that reminds me. Reminds me of I think I heard from Martin Fowler, which he was talking about a colleague of ours, David Rice, who was grumbling one day about hating architects, and Martin was laughing because David Rice was an architect at ThoughtWorks.
Yeah, the David Rice grumbling maybe wasn't sort of the rarest of occurrences. The biggest challenge with being an architect is that there's so many labels stuck to your role, sometimes very positive and sometimes very critical. At the same time, I'm not a big fan of sort of relabeling exercises. So I'm happy to just be called the architect. And if somebody doesn't like that, I said, well, rather than changing the word, let's redefine what that word should mean. And then we can put a more positive spin on what architecture is all about. But I don't believe in sort of just changing the label and somehow believing that makes a difference.
Absolutely. And what one of the things that amuses me in a different way is that I think that often you and I talk about, when we in blogs, stuff like that, you and I talk about very similar topics, similar ideas, only I'm coming at it labeling it from a software engineering point of view, and you're labeling it from an architecture point of view. And I agree with you. I don't really mind too much what the words are, except there's a degree to which words can kind of do the NLP kind of thing, where they can just help you think differently in sometimes. Anyway, we're kind of wandering off a track a bit. So
yeah, I get what you mean.
Yeah. So the idea of architects, I would agree 100%, and I liked your take on separating the idea of architecture from the idea of architects. It's not the province of some people in an ivory tower somewhere. It's a practical thing. One of the things that seems to me to be, let me ask this as a question rather than as a statement. So do you think that the role of somebody doing architecture needs to include technical ability to be able to touch the system at all levels of technical complexity? Should they still be programming?
My answer is yes, but not to deliver code. So, and I have a great example myself of an experience I have. So yeah, I work for a cloud provider, right? I figure like, oh yeah, I should try our own products, right? Like product company and not using a product, I find to be a little bit of a silly proposition. So I'm like, all right, I should go build something. So like almost a year ago, I said like, all right, let me build some serverless stuff. You mentioned enterprise integration patterns. So I took some of the examples from that book from 2003, Bobby Wolf and I wrote this and said, hey, what would these things look like if I build them on serverless? I don't my eyes wide open, like totally cool stuff, everything there, automation, auto scaling, all the kind of cool things. But what I brought back with me from this exercise was also some very different ideas on what serverless architecture means, application topology, the role of automation. So I came back, basically the code I wrote, I could almost throw away. It's like a toy code. It was like, demo code. But the reason the architects should dive into what I call the engine room and get hands-on is because they come back with a whole different set of ideas, right? They start understanding some of the constraints, some of the trade-offs, some of the relationships, and then looping those back to the teams, that has the value. So you should code as an architect, but not to actually deliver lines of code, but to understand the ramifications of the decisions you're making, because otherwise you do drift to the ivory tower, right? If this is one way and you never go and look sort of what happens, then that's the slippery slope to the ivory tower. So I'm a big fan of going down into the engine room.
Yeah, and this is your idea of the architect elevator, which is the way that you what you call your blog site. It's that idea of kind of bridging from the engine room to the boardroom kind of thing. That picture.
100% right. And this is another facet in which the role of the architect has changed very much, right? It used to be sort of like the architects make all the difficult to reverse decisions. I'm like, well, how can the architects be so smart that they can make all those decisions facing change, we already mentioned, and facing uncertainty? I'm like, wow, you must be at least smarter than I am as an architect. So the role has very much changed from making all the decisions, or let me put it another way. The role has really changed from trying to be the smartest person to making everybody else a little bit smarter, right? That's what I see as the role of an architect. Let the people who are better qualified to make the decisions, let them make the decision, but give them a different mental model or different ways to think about it, or highlight some trade-offs, make them smarter so they can make a better decision. And a key element in this is connecting across the layers, right? Organizations just have a lot of layers. There's the business strategy, the financials, the products, the product strategy, and somewhere down here, somebody is writing Helm charts or CDK code, right? And the question is, how does one contribute to the other? And normally there's like 15 lines of management in between separating the two. And I always say, this is one case where loose coupling is not good, right? Because you don't want to be decoupled between your business and your technology. So architects connecting across the layers, riding the elevator, that is a key aspect of how modern architects bring value in the organization.
I like that too. It's not surprising that I think I'm going to be agreeing with you quite a lot during the nature of this conversation. But one of the things that brings to mind. So the way that you're talking about that enabling a team through architects and architecture. I speak about that in terms of technical leadership. So it's the role of technical leadership to do that. And the mental model that I have in the back of my mind for thinking that is the idea of a sports team. The coach of a sports team doesn't have to be the best player, but they've got a different perspective, and they're looking at it from this different perspective that you're talking about. And their job is to try and get the best out of the players that are on the field. And it's a loose analogy, but it's one that's sort of stuck in my head. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about? So you're talking about strategy, tactics, and individual help to people in particular problems.
Absolutely. We already talked about sort of software delivery and architecture having sort of a healthy fuzziness. So I would say technical leadership and architecture has that even more so, right? So in the end, the only thing I would highlight, there's sort of two very different aspects on it. The technical leadership also includes people leadership, right? You make sure people have a purpose, they are motivated, know where they're going. And that's important for both architects and technical leaders. But there's also the content aspect, right?
Yes.
Like, what uncertainty do we need to deal with? Sort of what is the next business idea our business is likely to have, so we can maybe anticipate some of that, that change, that first derivative we talked about. So there's both the people leadership as well as the technical leadership, which really connects across the different layers. And doing both well, I think, are signatures of both a great technical leader and a great architect. If anything, sort of maybe one person is sort of 70-30 and the other person is maybe 30-70. There might be sort of a slightly different emphasis, but I come back again to my argument, one without the other is completely meaningless, right? So it's just like, you need to have both, and you can have a sweet spot in one or the other, but you got to stand on both legs. Otherwise it's going to get a little tiring to balance.
Yeah. So does this exploration start to get us to a point where we can start to say what architecture is?
Well, I always say when you use the word architecture, three different people might give you three different answers. And the irony is they could all be right. So we first need to see which architecture we're talking about, right? There's the architecture in the system. Like as soon as you have like two parts, they have an architecture, right? They're either connected or disconnected, or one is on top of the other, next to each other. You cannot compose something without an architecture, right? So that's always there. Then there's the architecture, which I think you refer to, like the act of choosing this structure, right? Like doing architecture. And then the third architecture is like, oh, let's talk to architecture, like the team, the function. So if we talk about the middle ground, right? To me, the key aspect of doing architecture in a way as being an architect or being somebody else doing architecture is, I come back to my things, right? Look at your system for more dimensions, for more aspects as you normally might, right? And design the system that it can cope with those external forces. And change and evolution is the primary one, as you already said. Kent has a lot of thoughts on that. And the reason architecture is getting also a boost recently, so let's remember, right? There was sort of a time when people thought we don't need much architecture, right? It was sort of you write in JavaScript, or no, this is like lucky go happy, right? We don't need architecture. And on top of that, there was sort of the notion that the big frameworks do your architecture, right? Like the J2EE kind of thing, like, oh, that's your architecture. It already comes from the vendor. So you just need to put a few lines of code here and there, right? There was a time when architecture had sort of a little winter. And in the last couple of years, we see a huge resurgence of it. And I think that has a couple of reasons. The one is rate of change is up, right? You can no longer build something and let it run for like 5 years, right? It's like a million things will change. Uncertainty is up because there's two kinds of change, right? There's change that you know, and there's change that you don't know. So they're like two slightly different dimensions of dealing with change.